accessory movements or complementary movements and why you would pick them. You talked about front squat versus hack squat, low bar versus high bar. So could you go over a few of those on the 3 lifts just to give your perspective?
Yeah, for sure.
On those? Cool.
So if I'm looking at the squat, what I'm going to be looking at is like the typical limiting factor of the squat is going to be a lot of people are just going to kind of lean forward in the hole, and they're going to kind of end up like good morning, like doing like more of like a good morning with the squat to stand up. And again, if the goal is to lift as heavy load as humanly possible, that's okay. Like I don't really care so much about how that's going to look and how that's going to be. I just care if they're able to complete the movement, right, and they're able to get the job done. But what we're going to look at is we're going to look at doing like pretty like other exercises that are going to train, probably like trying to train a different section of the muscle, right? So like if we look at where a barbell back squat is going to be the hardest, like that is in the hole. So it's at the bottom at where your hips are like 90 to below 90 degrees of range of motion, where the quad is in its most lengthened position in that context, right? So what we're going to look at doing is we're going to look at trying to train drills that might train the shortened position. We might do some other drills that are going to reinforce the lengthened position of the movement. So we're going to look at just like different drills and different exercises that we're going to use to kind of like train other ends of the range of motion to help build tissue resiliency. And then we're going to also look to reinforce the same one that we can do a little bit more, right? So for example, what we might do with that, if we're looking to train the lengthened position of the muscle, we might do something like a banded leg press or a banded hack, like a banded hack squat or a banded pendulum squat, or things like drills like that would train the shortened position of the muscle when you're at full extension of the knee and the hip. Right. So those are going to be exercises that are going to train the quad in a different position. And if we're looking to train the quad in the shortened, the lengthened position a little bit more, we might just have them do things like paused leg presses and paused like reverse banded hack squats and paused pendulum squats or paused belt squats or things like that, where they get to work on building a little bit more volume and time under tension in that, and a little bit more mechanical tension in that paused position, so they can actually get stronger in that area, right? Which is why I think like, if we're looking at training the lengthened position of the muscle, like pause squats are going to be one of the greatest exercises that you can do, because you just get to sit there for 2 seconds. So you get to just build up a lot, like you get to accumulate a lot more volume in that area that you need to train. And it's also specific enough that it's going to have a much faster transference over to your regular squat. Right. Because everything is the exact same. It's just a nice little load limiter that allows you to drive a little bit more volume and intensity and recover a little bit better from it, because it's not going to be as heavy overall. So like, that's really the way that I'm looking at this, is like, what I want to do is like, depending on how far out from a competition somebody is, like if they're relatively far out, I want to do some things that we're going to train the opposite end of the muscle. So we're going to train some like the shortened position versus the lengthened position. So the same thing with like a bench press, right? A lot of these people that I deal with have like a relatively large arch in their chest and in their back, and like a wide grip in the bench press, because they're looking at reducing range of motion as much as possible. But at the same time, we don't get much humeral adduction, so we don't get much actual pec contraction. So what we need to do is we need to pick exercises that are going to allow them to contract a pec and adduct a humerus, and like horizontally adduct a humerus. So we're going to do things like machine presses, as long as the machines have a convergent path and they get a little closer towards the end. We're going to do things like dumbbell pressing, and we're going to do things that like try to limit that arch as much as we possibly can, so we can get as much of a contraction in the pec as we possibly can, and move the actual head of the humerus and move and have the actual like insertion of the pec move closer to the origin, right? As opposed to leaving it all the way out here and just allowing it to go through like some sort of like a semi contraction where it's only training like the most stretched and eccentric portion of the movement. We're looking at doing other things that are going to allow them to just build up a little bit more resilience in the full ranges of the tissue, right? Where it's like, they're still going to be training that competition specific movement, but they're also going to be training the opposite thing as well. So it's like I was saying, like machine bench presses, dumbbell bench presses, close grip bench presses, things like that are going to start training the shortened position of the muscle in a position that is not a big arched competition specific position. Right. So it's like very flat back, big focus on the reach up at the top, so they can really focus on getting the full range of motion out of that muscle. And for deadlift, it's going to be the same kind of thing. So like with deadlift, I find that like, just because that one has a like specifically like a competition specific deadlift is mostly just a concentric movement. Like there's very little eccentric load in a competition deadlift, right? Because you don't get any points for slowly lowering the bar down to the floor. You just fatigue yourself out a little bit more than you would if you were to just like control the descent in general. So what I find with this is what we're looking to do is we're looking to do something that we can do to accumulate a little bit more concentric volume, maybe build up a little bit more eccentric volume, but usually accumulate a little bit more volume in general with a lot less axial fatigue and loading. So that's where, for a lot of my lifters, I throw in the trap bar because it's a lot easier movement to do. You can hinge it, and you can also kind of squat it a little bit. So you can create this kind of like hybrid hinge squat, which is probably going to be good for from a volume accumulation standpoint, because we're not going to be hinging this anywhere near as much. And with a trap bar, if you're doing like touch and go reps, it doesn't become an RDL very quickly like a regular barbell would. It becomes more of a squat, which is probably okay, because squat is one that you can probably recover from a little bit easier than deadlift in general. So if we're still accumulating a little bit more volume with it, if we're still able to drive a little bit more intensity with it, and that's the other great thing about the trap bar too, is like you can super maximally load it. So like for example, like I trained a lifter who like has his best deadlift right now is about 260 kilos, and he's pulled 305 for 5 on the trap bar. Like he pulled, so like what are you gonna say? He pulled 115% of his max for a set of 5. Yeah. Like that's
talk about overload. Yeah, that's
exactly. You talk about overload, like 115% for reps is pretty freaking solid. And then when you go to lift, when you go to train anything that's going to be lighter than that, it's not like it feels heavier because it's a barbell. Like the load is the load. So it doesn't feel like it's going to still feel relatively heavy. But when you go to your max on like a straight bar, it's not going to feel anywhere near as heavy, as long as we have some degree of specificity to kind of like get you back into setting up and doing everything in the right position. So like that's where I'm looking at with this is like I'm looking at like drills that are going to allow people to accumulate a lot more volume at a higher intensity with like equal or greater output than their competition specific movements, that'll allow us to just have a bit more of a like an either a direct or indirect transference over to their competition specific movement. So again, if I'm talking about like a squat, that's going to be something like a leg press, a hack squat, or like pause squats or something like that, like depending on what the person, like the athlete actually needs. Where if it's a bench press, what I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at doing some like machine chest pressing where we're working on the shortened position, close grip bench pressing where we're increasing the range of motion and we're actually getting a little bit more shoulder extension and shoulder flexion and adduction towards the top of the range of motion, or just things like that that are going to allow us to be in a slightly different position. And with those two, we're looking at not arching the back as much as possible. We're looking at just trying to keep everything as flat and as straight as we possibly can, so we can work the opposite end of the spectrum as much as we possibly can. And with deadlifts, it's going to be whatever we can do to accumulate a little bit more volume with less fatigue. So that's going to be like a trap bar deadlift for a conventional deadlifter, maybe even a conventional deadlift for a sumo deadlifter, or something like that, that we're going to be able to just get a little bit more work done without having to worry about the recovery demands. And like another one that's great for both sumo and conventional deadlifts is the RDL. Like I think the RDL is one of the most underrated exercises that exists. And like it's very highly rated to begin with, but I think it's very underrated still because it's just such a good exercise for people to do. Like if you struggle to get the bar off the floor, RDLs are going to help you. If you struggle to like lock the bar out, RDLs are going to help you. Like if you struggle with grip, RDLs are going to help you. Like it's just one of those things where no matter what you have, the RDL is probably going to be a good thing that you can do, particularly because like it becomes a very heavily loaded single joint movement. Like the greatest thing, the thing that has the greatest degree of range of motion in that is going to be just the pelvis and the hips in general. So the hips are going in the like a great degree of hip flexion and extension, where the knee is staying relatively stable and the ankle staying relatively stable as well. So like smashing some heavy RDLs is a phenomenal way that you can build up a lot more strength in your deadlift without as much fatigue, because the load has to be a little bit less, but the load doesn't have to be so much less than you think you would.
Yeah, and there's also the component that you're starting from the top, you have the eccentric portion, you have a little bit of stretch reflex that you can use instead of literally starting from a dead stop at the bottom,
Exactly.
which neurologically is a lot more taxing.
Exactly. And that's one of those things. It's like we were saying, like you can accumulate a ton more volume in an RDL. Like I can have somebody RDL 2 to 3 times a week, where maybe they can only conventionally deadlift once a week because it's just so much more taxing and fatiguing on the system.
Yeah. I wanted to bounce back on a few points that you mentioned through this little piece. So I've heard say in the realm of powerlifting, specifically in terms of squat range of motion, that you might want to actually limit your squat range of motion to what you would want to do in a competition setting, so that you're not exposing yourself to potentially, going much lower than you just should to make the lift, and hence almost like restricting your own range of motion so that you're just doing what you need to kind of successfully lift the bar in competition. So you talked a lot about the different squat variations. What's your position on this in terms of, do you go all the way to the bottom in a front squat because it is a different movement? Do you still try to kind of stay within the parameters of a competition lift if you're doing the squat competition style? What's your take on that?
So my take on that is, if it's not specific, I want to make it as non-specific as possible. That's really what it comes down to. Is if it's a specific movement, I want to train for as much specificity as we possibly can. Mm. So like, that's where we're going to be replicating the comps, like everything about the competition lift. So it's going to be to the competition depth. You're going to set up the competition way. You're going to brace the competition way. You're going to do everything the way that we're going to do for the prescribed sets and reps and volume that you're going to look for. Mm-hmm. But for other things, I want to limit that as much as we possibly can, because what I want to do is I want to be able to start training other ends of the range of motion, so we can build up deficits that develop. Right. So that's one of those things where if you're consistently training the same position over and over and over again, yes, you are going to get stronger, but you're also probably going to be leaving some gains on the table by not training other positions and other ranges of motion. Right. Where it's like we talked about it. Like, if you only ever train the lengthened position of your quad, like, that's it. That's all you've got. And it's like, you should probably end up training the shortened position of your quads a little bit more too, because then you might not have as good of a deadlift. Yeah. Right. It's like, it's just one of those things where we need to start training both ranges of motion. And I think that when we're looking at like the movement continuum, keep your specific stuff specific. And then the stuff that is not specific to it, there's no need to be just so emotionally attached to it that it has to replicate all comp standards, because you're not competing in that movement. Like, I've never seen a powerlifter go up to a bar and then front rack it and then do like a half range, like a front squat to depth and be like, yeah, I got it. It's like, no, you're putting it on your back. You're getting a low bar, wider stance position, and just going as deep as necessary to get white lights. Where if you're looking at it from like a front squat or like a hack squat, training that exact position is probably going to be like not giving you the same level of performance that you could be getting if you were to train it from a greater degree or to a greater range of motion. So I want you to keep your specific stuff as specific as possible in terms of movement and like movement, like strategy, and then your non-specific stuff as non-specific as possible, and just maximize your output in those areas.
Yeah. So literally you're pushing at both ends of the spectrum, the specificity and the general side of things.
Exactly. And that's the thing. That's the thing that I want is like, if we're looking at like trying to keep everything as specific as possible, like I just don't think we're going to get there.
Yeah. What are these implications on that continuum of specificity versus general? What are the implications from a health standpoint and an injury prevention standpoint?
Injury prevention is something that I don't know if we can really even predict reliably. So that's not something that I would know if we could even say that this is going to have a little bit more ability to prevent than anything else. But the way that I'm looking at this right now is, and like I've had this conversation with a couple different people. So the way that I kind of frame this conversation is that we can all agree that physics exists. Mm-hmm. We can all agree that joint axes exist. And then we can all agree that forces are going to be placed in different areas, and muscle tissue is going to be the prime mover or the agonist mover in certain ranges of motion based off of physics and joint axes. Mm-hmm. So if we're looking at this in terms of fatigue management and volume accumulation, that's one of the other reasons why I want things to be as non-specific as possible, because I don't necessarily want every single thing that a person is doing to stress the exact same tissues as their competition-specific movement. Mm. Right. And again, if we're just looking at that from a physics standpoint, if we're looking at that from like in a low bar back squat, like the posterior chain is going to be the prime mover, because the knee doesn't translate forward anywhere near as much. The body has to, the torso has to incline a little bit or recline a little bit to create the movement and to keep the bar over the middle of the foot. But because of that, we're probably going to be getting a little bit more lower back, glute, hamstring, quad. Mm. Right. And it's probably going to go a little bit more in that order of muscle recruitment. Like, well, when the knees flex, you're still going to be getting quads, but because of the position that the body is moving into, we're probably also going to be getting a little bit more glute and lower back.
Yeah.
Where it's like if we're looking at this in terms of volume accumulation, if every single thing that we're doing replicates that position as much as we possibly can, we are now robbing from our potential ability to perform better on deadlifts, because we are now just recreating that same exercise over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we may not have as much that we can do in terms of performance for our deadlift. So we may be robbing from that position a little bit more because we have an emotional attachment to this specificity mindset, right? So that's what I'm looking at this as, is like, and that's one of the biggest things that people keep talking about, where it's like load management is the most important thing. And I'm like, I agree, but that's why biomechanics matters. Because if we're looking at this from just like a physics standpoint, we can all agree that physics exists. So we can all agree that certain muscles are going to be the agonist in certain positions. So that we can all agree that load management is important in those positions, but then biomechanics doesn't exist and matter. Where it's like, I don't understand that inability to bridge from like, okay, well that makes sense, to, okay, then yes, biomechanics and exercise selection does matter for this, because we're just looking at this in a tissue distribution and like a stress distribution model and standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
where if we're consistently only training the same thing, yes, you're going to adapt to it. And like this, like specificity is the mother of all principles and the mother of everything. And you're going to adapt to whatever demands you're placing on it. But at the same time, if we then have to rob from other exercises to allow you to recover from this because you're not respecting biomechanics and physics, I feel like that's just like a thing that you're doing that's going to rob people from performance,
Mm-hmm.
because we're not allowing to maximize output over the course of a week, a training cycle, or a training, like a generalized training block or a prep, which means that you may have left gains and like some gains on the table because we didn't understand and respect physics, biomechanics, and tissue management, or like tissue loading.